go. When the grounds are open, she serves as a guide in the house when asked, and she portrays a 19th century school marm. Pretty appropriate for all those school groups that come by. She assists with the living history camp and helps decorate the house for the Christmas holiday tours. At the suggestion of the Farm Museum's assistant curator, Laura Rogers, for over a year, Bev has been researching and gathering information on the history of the house and the folks that live there. So now I would like to have you turn your attention to Bev and hear her presentation.
Well, hello. Thank you for that kind introduction. Good afternoon. I'm Beverly Humbert. Thanks to the Historical Society for the invitation to present today. And I'd like to give a shout out to my friends at the Farm Museum that might be listening. I miss you all. First, please know I'm not a trained historian or researcher, and COVID has limited my time digging further into the Almshouse history. But I have enjoyed myself these last many months gathering information for this presentation. Given only 50 minutes, I've had to be very selective in the material offered today. So if I'm correct, Lynn, I go down to share screen.
Yep.
Share.
Now you have a Zoom, you're sharing your screen, but it's showing your Zoom. So can you go to your PowerPoint?
Yes, ma'am. And I need, how do I get to the back?
Just stop sharing. Stop sharing, hit the red button.
Okay.
Open your PowerPoint.
Stop share. Boom.
Now, is your PowerPoint open on your desktop?
No, ma'am.
Okay, open your PowerPoint.
Okay, I need to figure out how to get there.
It's in your documents. You should.
It's on my desktop.
Yep,
But I
okay.
have.
Now,
this
once you
was so simple
complete your
yesterday.
PowerPoint, then you can share your screen again.
Okay.
By
Share
clicking
my
on the
screen
green
again.
button. Yeah. Now click on your PowerPoint.
Ken,
Can you click on your PowerPoint?
I don't see it. Oh, wait. My husband's in the next room.
All right, well, maybe he'll stop sharing again because you
Okay.
see your PowerPoint on your screen. You see your,
It's on my desktop.
Okay, minimize your screen.
Minimize my screen.
Turn on your PowerPoint.
PowerPoint's right there.
Click on
Aha.
Happened last time when I was on Zoom. We could do it on yours.
well.
Now I go to share
Just a
screen,
minute.
Lynn.
Remember how we used to be patient with each other when we would start PowerPoint in a physical room. So this will just, there we go, Bev. Now hit slideshow and from beginning. Perfect.
Oh,
And kudos to your tech whiz in your
yes. I'm not a trained computer person either,
You're
so
doing just fine. You're doing
let's
just
get started. Today we'll become familiar with the Carroll County Almshouse, how it originated, functioned, and served our citizens of Carroll County for 112 years. We will meet some residents and discover their stories and how the house supported them. We will hear tidbits of eventful information that helps us understand the extraordinary role the Almshouse played in the history of Carroll County, especially during its most active period from 1853 to around the turn of the century, give or take a few years. To acquaint some of you or reacquaint others with the Almshouse on South Center Street, we're going to see photographs of the exterior and interior of the building. The interior you will see shows how a middle to upper income farming family would have lived in the 1880s. This display was put into place when the house was renovated and opened in 1967, a year after the formal opening of the Farm Museum. Operating as the Almshouse, Please imagine it with different furniture, potted plants sitting on the windows, and whitewashed walls. You see the front of the building is a 3-storied house with a basement. We're going to move into the foyer. Straight ahead of the stairs that take you up to the 2nd and 3rd floors. The residence dining is on the right, and the parlor here is on the left. Also the sitting room you see decorated for Christmas. We move into the study today, but it was originally used as the chapel for Sunday worship, led by college seminarians or local preachers. This was also the room for funeral services of deceased residents. This is the grown-up or adult bedroom, along with the children's room that were originally 4 rooms. Their use was varied over many years: laundry storage, food storage, cooling pies, whatever was the need. And in about 1910, there was the wall division of this room on the right side allowed it to be a hospital room with its own bed, chairs, and commode. This was the room for sick residents waiting to see the doctor. Now the stairs lead to the 2nd and 3rd floors. On the 3rd floor, there were accommodations for 30 women and children. Today, our antiques are stored there. The 2nd floor is used for housing the steward and his family. And even today, the caretaker and his family live there. You can see how far up the 3rd floor is. The steward's dining room held formal meals on Sunday or when the commissioners visited. The kitchen, seen today, received a major renovation. I understand it's originally stretched across the whole width of the house. The residence dining room at the front of the house is today's volunteer parlor or tea parlor. Holiday teas for the public should hopefully continue when the county opens up. The Living History Center was originally the men's dormitory or men's quarters or dormitory. Today it is used for artisan studios and display during school tours and weekend events. You'll see on the right the tunnel that was put in about 1910 that was to make getting up to the 2nd floor easier for the residents. This is a picture of a man's room set up about how it would have looked 140 years ago. The Alms barn was built by Andrew Slonaker in or around 1853 to 56, and the cost was $1,525. I'd like to read you something I've written about my reflections about my research and the property. It's inspiring to experience the present Farm Museum as a place that shows how Carroll County agriculture made a contribution to the farming industry over several centuries, but more importantly, to understand and appreciate how the county took care of its poor and needy for 112 years. This is a slide overlooking the farm as it is today. During the house's tenure as the Almshouse from 1853 to 1965, it was a functioning farm, serving between 20 and 70 residents at different times in its history. The idea of farming not only helped feed the residents, but kept them active, happy, and involved. This photo is from today with the remaining spring house, smokehouse, blacksmith building, dormitory, and Living History Center, and the Alms barn. But imagine the place filled with an apple orchard near the front of the property, a small pond on the edge of the front lawn, 12 large maple trees protecting the front door entrance, a large chicken enclosure at the rear of the house, a full stone wall surrounding the front of the Alms barn, a 2-story hog pen, an ice house, pastures of cows, a hillside potato and cabbage patch, fields of wheat, barley, and rye, and a $5 outhouse. Oh, to be clear, that was the cost of construction in 1853. The Carroll County Almshouse can be traced from traditions carried by English settlers that inherited the practice of care for the poor and needy from the days of the early church. For Carroll County, prior to and after the creation of the almshouse, the county additionally paid various amounts of money a year to trustees willing to take in and care for folks in need. These persons were called outdoor pensioners. Excuse me, I have a frog in my throat. Well, the next question is, how did the almshouse come to Carroll County? When the county was created in 1853, the Maryland legislature said that the county had to create a jail, a courthouse, and an almshouse. In 1942, when word got out that the commissioners of tax, as they were called then, were looking for land for an almshouse, several letters of proposal came in. This is a letter from John McCullum from the State Archives. This letter offers his property for sale to the commissioners. It briefly says, he has 230 acres for sale, filled with 60 acres of timber, fields with chestnut railed fences and running water in each field. There's a large quarry and an orchard filled with apple trees brought from New York by Mr. Winchester. You are welcome to come by and see for yourself. The cost is $12,000. The Maryland legislature originally authorized the purchase of only 150 acres for the farm. The idea for an almshouse sat idle until 1852, give or take a few years. Most likely during this time, there were negotiations in progress to put together more acreage. Remember Mr. McCullough's offer of property? Well, in 1851, William Morley purchased a portion of it and included it in a larger piece of land. This articles of agreement that you see was a preliminary agreement made for the county to purchase 307 acres from Joshua Smith and his wife, Julia, William Worley and his wife, Lydia, and Jesse Warfield, the farmer, not the doctor, provided the legislature lifted their acreage restriction. The state did lift this restriction, and this agreement that you see is dated 1853, and it briefly says that the three sellers did sign the agreement in the presence of two state justices of the peace, confirming the sale to the county. The final cost was $17,826. I find it interesting to read at the bottom of this agreement that the women were separated from their husbands and questioned by the justice of the peace about the sale of this property. Historian Mimi Ashcraft tells me that most likely this was done to determine if they were being forced into the sale of the property, or if this was a part of any dowry they might be sacrificing. Now, after Thomas Comegs won the bid to make brick on the property using clay found there, and the commissioners agreed to provide firewood for firing the kilns. By the way, Mr. Comegs made 220,000 bricks. David Stoner from Waynesboro, Pennsylvania, won the bid to build the house for $4,769. This is the first of a six-page document that I found at the archives. And the front page says briefly that the basement is made of brick prepared for a furnace with 18-inch walls. There are 2 cross passageways and 4 cells or rooms with a door to each on the first floor. Yes, in May of 1853, notice was placed in the newspaper that the almshouse was now accepting paupers. Well, who will operate the place? It was not unusual for citizens in the various small towns to draw up petitions and leave them at the general store for citizens to sign, recommending the name of the next steward. But in the end, the stewards were selected by their skill set and their proclaimed political party. Whatever political party the majority of commissioners belonged to, so must the new steward. It was assumed that the wife and family would come along and participate in the care of the house and its residents. There was a need for a salaried steward, along with a paid chambermaid or two, a cook, a seamstress, a washerwoman, a fireman to control heating the house and providing firewood where needed, a teamster to work in the barn, plus seasonal field help was hired. And this is a list of the stewards over the years. To give you a hint of the quality of the persons appointed to be the steward, let me introduce a few to you. Commissioner John Mailhorn was the first person who set up the Almshouse. He made purchases of furniture, food, and necessary apparel for residents. John Meacham followed him for a short time. Jacob Grove and his second wife, Mary, were at the house from 1854 to 1859. Mr. Grove came to the house after serving as sheriff from 1851 to 53, and he was one of the many citizens that witnessed the placement of the courthouse cornerstone in 1838. Granville Wilson and his wife Annie came in 1868 with 3 children. They stayed for 4 years. Mr. Wilson went on to become manager of the Montour House on Main Street. After the hotel was renovated, he and the family moved to Hagerstown. John Tracy and his wife Mary were appointed caretakers in 1873. John was only 34 years old and had already been the sheriff and served as clerk of elections for District 6 in 1870. They brought 5 children with him. During Mr. Tracy's tenure, he took full advantage of the property. The Democratic Advocate wrote of his excellent farming skills in 1874 with the production of, listen carefully, 361 bushels of wheat, 1,350 bushels of corn, 120 bushels of potatoes, 108 bushels of barley, 8,000 head of cabbage, 80 bushels of turnips, 9,270 pounds of pork, along with beef, milk, butter, eggs, poultry, and garden vegetables. An article in the newspaper highlights his participation in the 1877 agricultural fair with his draft horse, plus several hogs and sheep. They retired to Reisterstown. The Kohlers came in 1880 after the Tracys. James and Elizabeth brought with them a blended family complete with 3 children, followed by the birth of 4 more while in the Almshouse. Besides all these children, Elizabeth's nephew Clinton lived with them too. It was during this time period that the number of wayfaring travelers or tramps visiting the house became overwhelming. From 1906 to 1913, Augustus Humbert and Ida served the house. Well liked by the community and the residents, Mr. Humbert continued to show interest in town events and often participated in the Grange Farmers Parade on horseback and served on the town registration and polling committees. Like the Hans earlier, the Humberts returned for a second tenure at the house. From 1915 to 1917, William and Maggie Barnes and son James Carroll were caretakers. Trained as a butcher, William left his profitable business in New Windsor and came to the farm. Besides being able to butcher meat for the staff and residents, the sale of meat and hides often provided income for use in the house. William and Maggie's great-granddaughter, Jerry Reck, and her husband Don live today within sight of the Almshouse. At the age of 48, Harvey and Debbie Lambert came to the Almshouse from 1918 to 1925. There were 6 children in the house with them. They came from New Windsor where they lived in a multi-generational farm. Upon leaving the house, they moved to 30 West George Street in town. Debbie died in 1950 and Harvey died in 1963. I'll give you a minute to look at this. This is a picture from the Baltimore Sun, 1908, a picture of the dormitory. Remember, I told you it was the building set aside for the men and boys. There were 10 rooms for sleeping, with the summer kitchen for cooking, butchering, and laundry. I was unable to find much information on its construction, but newspaper articles talk about the need for renovations in 1894. And in 1911, a contract was awarded to Charles Hunter to add on to the dormitory at a cost of $323. And the county promised that they would be responsible for the doors, the windows, and the blinds. Now let's meet a few of our lady residents. I would imagine these pictures are taken about the 1920s. These ladies are standing on the back porch in their white aprons, which were traditional gifts at Christmas. And this is a better picture. And these two ladies are on their way to the spring house. Now I'd like to talk about some of the folks that were residents at the house. In going through the list of residents I have from 1863 to 1965, I'm sure there are many folks missing who availed themselves of the Almshouse. The names were retrieved from census reports, newspaper clippings, funeral announcements, and the Historical Society's website. The basic list I was given a few years ago that was formatted by Mimi Ashcraft and George and Ann Horvath. Another researcher by the name of Pat Brodowski added to this list many years ago. However, I made it a point to ancestry and newspaper research every single individual that appears on the list. And from this effort, I came across the sampling of residents that have stories to tell. It's important to understand, prior to the turn of the century, the house was very diverse. Persons of color, immigrants from Germany, Ireland, England, Prussia, were all represented at the house. Folks from all walks of life and financial means came to the Almshouse for all sorts of reasons. When listening to their stories, please think about who came for companionship and a place to end their days in comfort and respect. Try to figure out who came for either physical or mental healing, who felt a calling to stay and make themselves worthy, who moved in to find security and acceptance for their medical condition, who was desperate to return to a place he knew would accept him and was taken in by an act of compassion. On a happier note, who resided here as a worker, lucky enough to find love. The thing to remember is that they were all here and Carroll County cared for them. Let's meet a few. Reuben Stem, probably a familiar name to you, was constable for many years, beginning with his appointment by the county commissioners in December of 1869. His responsibilities were to serve the needs of the court system, handling auctions of properties and estates. He and Eliza had 3 sons. One son, John, went on to be sheriff of Westminster. Reuben died at the age of 70 at the Almshouse on September 8, 1885. He's buried at St. John's. Daniel Stonecipher arrived at the Almshouse from Union Mills in 1887. He was 34 years old. This is a sad story with evidence of the care and acceptance provided by the Almshouse, but the insufficiency of medicine 130 years ago. An obituary from the Democratic Advocate reads, May of 1889, that Daniel Stonecipher was found dead in his room at the Almshouse last Monday morning. He was moral and hardworking until epilepsy took a hold of his life about 15 years ago. Unable to keep a job due to his condition, he was forced to leave his wife and children residing in Union Mills and take up residency at the house about 2 years ago. Well liked and respected, a large number of friends gathered for his burial at the Methodist Episcopal Church in Union Mills. He was 36 years old. During the blizzard of 1894, the cold weather, poor health, and poverty caught up with Mrs. Ellen Johnson. Found by her neighbors, she was placed in the almshouse. Struggling with disease, she dreaded the idea of a pauper's burial. With the assurance of Mrs. Hahn, the steward's wife, plus students from the College Christian Association, Mrs. Johnson was promised a proper Christian funeral and burial. She died on Sunday, February 20th in 1897. As promised, led by Mary Shellman, a small group of caring citizens followed her wagon-drawn casket to Westminster Cemetery, where, led by the Methodist preacher, hymns were sung and prayers were said over Mrs. Johnson that day. With the benefit of an article from the Catoctin History magazine, written by Mimi Ashcraft and Ned Landis in 2012, may I introduce you to resident Ernest Kohler. Ernest suffered both physically and mentally due to his participation in the Civil War. Wounded in the left knee at the Battle of Fair Oaks in Richmond, he walked with his unit over 150 miles towards Pennsylvania. With heat and rain, over 500 men fell to the roadside during this walk. That included Mr. Kohler, who fell near Uniontown and was rescued by a local farmer. He remained mentally affected by the war his entire life. By July, he was listed on the rolls as a deserter. Soon after, Westminster's provost marshal found him living in the woods near town. After an interview with Ernest, he was released from duty, but the marshal did not file the report with the authorities. Ernest remained a deserter in the eyes of the Union Army. He spent 30 years living alone in Westminster. The 1890 Special Schedule of Surviving Soldiers, Sailors, Marines, and Widows for Carroll County lists him as living at the Almshouse in October of 1890. What date he exactly arrived is not known. But after 17 years at the house, frail and broken, he died there on December 10th, 1907. Instead of a pauper's grave, Mary Shellman insisted his burial be in Westminster Cemetery alongside 5 other Civil War soldiers. Time prevents us from hearing the rest of his story. Now, Edgar Yarnell. This is really a story of despair for Edgar. Little is known about Edgar's background except his family resided in Philadelphia. Edgar had lived in Westminster around 1908, where he was employed by the phone company as a bill collector. In 1911, he was a patient at Mount Alto Tuberculosis Hospital in Pennsylvania. How or why he returned to Westminster is unknown. By the end of the first week of February 1912, he was living at the Main Court Hotel. It was obvious he was penniless and in very poor health. The hotel guests complained. The manager telegraphed Edgar's brother Leon in Philadelphia to come get him or send a ticket for his return home. There was no response. Fear and stigma of the disease often kept families from claiming their loved ones. But within a day, Mr. Humbert, the steward, arrived in his wagon to take Edgar back to the almshouse for care and comfort. Shortly after, Edgar died. Successfully contacting Leon in Philadelphia, money was sent at that time for Edgar's body to be returned home. Now, Dr. Hanson Dratch, 1915 was the date of his death, but he was raised a farmer, but turned to medicine and served the people of Hampstead for years. Besides medicine in the 1880s, the newspaper talks briefly about his limited involvement in the county government. By 1900, the census shows that he had moved to Woolery District. It's unclear when he moved into the Almshouse, but he dies there in 1915. His son, Dr. Henry Dratch, consistently paid his father's bills at the Almshouse. Ezra Fair. Ezra loved the animals at the farm and was in charge of taking care of the hogs. Born in 1857, he was one of 7 children from a farming family in Hampstead. Throughout his life, he traveled around different communities as far away as York, Pennsylvania, doing odd jobs. Records indicate that he was admitted to the house in 1930 at the age of 70. He appears on the 1940 census as well. Despite suffering several severe injuries at the farm, Ezra remained to do his part. Transported to the University of Maryland Hospital after bed rest for 4 weeks there, he passed away from old age at the age of 87. That makes him a resident at the house for 17 years, and he's buried in Hampstead. On a happier note, a story of romance. John Sherfy was the fireman at the house in 1910. He was in charge of keeping the house warm and chopping firewood for the boiling pots of water in the laundry. He was 32 years old. Annie Mumford was a maid living at the house at the same time. She was 18. I'd like to imagine the secretive yet romantic courtship that happened with their conversations over the clothesline, their exchange of a smile through an open window, and their walks through the streets of Westminster that led to their union on a snowy day in the spring of 1911. They went on to live in Westminster and raised 4 children. Some of our oldest and longest residing folks at the Almshouse. Dinah Hipsley was a woman of color, born in 1770. Census showed her as a resident at the house in 1860. That makes her 90 years old at the Almshouse at that time. That's the only information I could find on her. Schraff's History of Western Maryland talks about Old Becky. A woman of color, Becky McCormick, had been a resident for 12 to 14 years prior to her death at the age of 112, give or take a few years, on Sunday, March 9th, 1879. She was a religious woman that enjoyed singing through the house and praying and pleading for the good Lord to take her home. You may know of the newspaper reports in 1859 that talk about Old Becky's granddaughter with the same name being the first to suffer death upon the scaffold in this county for the brutal murder of a 12-year-old boy. Mary Little, or Granny Little, as she was affectionately called, was born in 1801. She was widowed from George Little in 1883. She came immediately to the house and lived there for 17 years until her death at the age of 100. Her support for living there was provided each year by her husband's trust and mailed in by his executor. She's buried alongside her husband in Adams County. Census states that William Blizzard was born about 1813. His age while a resident at the house in 1910 was 97 years old. Could this be the same William Blizzard that was paid $4.25 in July of 1857 for hauling stone from Baltimore to the Almshouse? Now, Blizzard is a common name in Carroll County, but I like to think that he returned to the house at the end of his life, perhaps due to a memory of kindness he felt while visiting there at an earlier time. William is buried in Potter's Field. This woman, Sarah, could have been in the previous category as someone who stayed because it was the only place she knew to call home. Sarah was a highly respected resident at the Almshouse. At the age of 20, she moved into the house to care for her mother. After her mother died, Sarah spent the rest of her life at the Almshouse. That was a total of 45 years. She was very pleasant and loved by everyone. On Sundays, she traveled with her friends to attend the Methodist church in town, and she was a constant companion and helper to many at the house. She died the week of October 23rd, 1908, minutes after returning to her room. Services were held at the house with many floral tributes filling the room. A large number of church and community friends attended her funeral and burial at Westminster Cemetery. Now, there's been a folklore about these two women for years at the house. Residents Lizzie Slorp and Mary Fossey were like twins, both in appearance and sisterly affection, but they were not related. Lizzie grew up near Sandymount with her parents and two brothers. She never attended school. We find her on the 1900 census at the age of 40 at the Almshouse, where she remained until 1930 or later. When her brother Jacob died, he left instructions in his will to provide money for Lizzie's stay at the house. Mary Fossey is difficult to track down. The spelling of her name changes with every census taker. It's reported that she first came to the Almshouse at the age of 16 in 1870. She too is at the house through the 1920 census. If she did arrive in 1876, that makes her a resident for over 40 years. I found written evidence that early on, the area today known as Potter's Field, once the ground for pauper burials, was covered in thick weeds and briars. During the tenure of Mr. Lambert between 1918 and 1925, he, Mr. Stoner, a local undertaker, and Commissioner Melville formally laid out the 3rd-acre property near today's Burns baseball field on the edge of the Almshouse property, and they called it Potter's Field. It's obvious by some headstone dates, death dates, that the formal recognition of Potter's Field came several years after residents were first buried on this spot. With the large number of residents that were housed at the Almshouse for over 112 years, it's impossible to verify the unidentified number of people that received pauper burials in Potter's Field or elsewhere on the property. And I'm sure many headstones have fallen away in disrepair. I've since learned from the present Farm Museum curator, Scott Holniger, that any number of individuals could be buried across the property. According to Mimi Ashcraft, it was the standard 150 years ago. If there was a criminal, if one was a criminal, committed suicide or died under suspicious reasons in the community, they most likely were buried where convenient on the farm property or in the pauper's burial area at Westminster Cemetery. This is a list of marked gravestones from the cemetery. However, it is reported from my list of residents that at least 10 other individuals were additionally buried here, but have no headstone. Those individuals are on the right side that you see there on the screen. From 1873 until 1892, the Almshouse catered to the tramps that arrived in town. The citizens of the town were pleasant to the visitors as best they could by offering a meal or a coin, but quickly the attitude of the tramps changed to occasional aggression towards the townspeople. After an ineffective law was written in 1890, finally in 1892, the tramp law was enforced by the courts to deal with the overflow of these folks. Statistical evidence shows how the Almshouse dealt with the tramps that came for a hot and a cot over many years. These numbers that you see were found in the Democratic Advocate under Annual Statement of County Expenses. The following excerpts indicate some of the findings. I'm going to just touch on a few. Please read to yourself, as I mentioned, a few that I'm going to select. Stuart Wilson accommodated 742 travelers with supper, lodging, and breakfast from March 1st, 1869 to March 1st, 1870. Moving ahead, records show that in 1876 to May of 1877, 2,468 tramps were fed on the back granite step of the house. For comparison's sake, the town population in 1875 was 3,200. And in 1890 to 1891, 2,750 tramps came to the house for lodging. Meals served reached almost 6,000. Following this major influx of persons, the state finally instituted the tramp law of 1892 that briefly says, if taken by the sheriff to the jail for your actions around town, you were subject to hard labor on the streets, breaking stone. If you failed to do so, you were fed only bread and water until you changed your mind. Judge Roberts enforced this law eagerly, and instead of 100 folks in jail each month, as it was prior to 1892, the number dropped to only a dozen by the fall of 1892. Of interest, on May 28, 1882, the Democratic Advocate wrote that a fire broke out in the jail the morning before. The neighboring Taylor Works steam whistle sounded the alarm. The damage was too severe for the 16 prisoners to return. They were removed to the Almshouse for safekeeping. Paid guards watched over them for 5 months until repairs could be made at the jail. I'll give you a minute to look at that. Not only was the house a place for the poor and needy, but upon occasion, it housed those with mental disabilities until, depending on the severity of that disability, those residents would be moved to a hospital setting. You can see those hospitals listed. In those cases, in the cases that it became necessary, in those cases, it became necessary for the visiting doctor to recommend the placement of an almshouse resident into a mental hospital. It was required that he get a second opinion to sign off on the transfer. This was also true when a family in the community made such a request or the court made a recommendation for placement. As required by the state of Maryland, all costs for these patients were to be paid by the county. It should be known that occasionally the patient's family would be financially responsible for the account and send reimbursement to the county clerk. You can read for yourself those expenses from the early years to 1960. There were several groups responsible for overseeing the house and the residents, plus the jail. One of the tasks of the court appointed grand jury was to tour both facilities quarterly. Over the years, these routine visits were to make sure everything was in operating order and that the residents and the farm property were being taken care of. If recommendations were given, it was the responsibility of the county to make these changes and improvements. With few exceptions, their published reports on the condition of the house and the jail were always complimentary. The Maryland Prisoners Aid Society and the Maryland Lunacy Commission made annual visits. The president of the Prisoners Aid Society, several representatives, and a clergy person came to inspect the facilities to offer a worship service for the residents and pass that literature in hopes that one day, should they leave, they would be set on the road to salvation. The job of the Lunacy Commission was to inspect the condition of the house and those residents labeled insane on the census at that time. With today's elderly dementia, depression, and commonly seen mental health issues, these same kind of symptoms 140 years ago, unfortunately, were cause for incorrectly labeling some people as insane. You will see that in the census reports. This is a major issue that should be considered when doing your research and a subject for discussion at another time. Well, how were the residents entertained? It was thought that the way to keep the residents healthy and happy was to put them to work, either inside with knitting, sewing, churning butter, helping in the kitchen, or outside with gardening. But for those afternoons or evenings of silence, attempts were made to entertain and bring some joy to their days. Here is a list for your review of events over the years collected from the Democratic Advocate and the Carroll County Times. College seminarians came for worship and song, local churches, scouts, music, sleigh rides, and Mary Shellman, who was a well-known citizen and often called Santa Claus at the Almshouse. For each year, she remembered residents with a Christmas celebration. From 1895 until 1918, she wrote an appeal for donations in the newspaper, asking for fruit, candy, socks, gloves, aprons, slippers, tobacco, and knickknacks for the residents' rooms. On Christmas or New Year's Day, there would be a bountiful dinner served both to residents and the steward's family with friends. Following dinner, there would be a worship service in the front dining room with carols and scripture. The evening would end with gift giving to the residents. It was the highlight of the season. Now, it's important to elaborate on the effectiveness of such a caring place in Carroll County. With the county's generosity, the skill and selection of excellent caretakers or stewards, and the fact that the men and women residents kept separate quarters, these all led to the positive reviews consistently given by the grand jury. Well, the last grand jury visit in 1959 started the wheel rolling towards closing the Almshouse. Extensive improvement costs, plus the availability of social services, local nursing facilities, all led to the decision to close the house. From here on, the story continues as the property known as the Carroll County Farm Museum. I'd like to extend my appreciation to you folks that are watching and listening today. Thank you very much. Also, thanks to my husband, Ken, for his patience and encouragement. To Laura Rogers, the assistant curator at the Farm Museum, for her friendship and warmth. To Mimi Ashcraft, historian, for her inspiration. To Dr. Jesse Glass, author, for his example of to persevere. He said, please mention his name. To Kathy Beatty, curator, for her ready information. To Scott Holniger, curator at the Farm Museum, for his knowledge and courtesy. To Joanne Wendt, the director of the Farm Museum, for her ongoing support. So that concludes my presentation. Chris, I'm open to questions.
Well, Beverly, this is so fascinating. I really love this presentation for sure. But I cannot believe it. I cannot believe you got all this research in less than 2 years.
There's a lot more. I had to narrow it down.
Unbelievable. So can you just talk a little bit about some of the places you visited or how you were able to do so much during this time of COVID?
well, prior to COVID, I'd been to the state archives several times. When you go to the state archives and you ask for what do they have on the Carroll County, on the Almshouse, they bring out the cart with 23 of the archival boxes, and there are files in each of the boxes for every year at the Almshouse. And in those files are receipts and all kinds of sorts of things. But in the first few files were those documents that I showed you pictures of. The 6-page written description by Stoner of the house, the deed, which I did not show you, but I did show you the preliminary agreement between the 3 sellers in the county. There were several petitions that were written in the community. Like I mentioned about how the petitions would be placed in the general store for people to sign. There are several of those. And it's really moving to open those things up, and they're, they fold out on themselves, and to see all the signature of the townspeople in Silver Run or in down in Gamber or Mechanicsville. It was really interesting to see that. Also, Mimi and I worked with some of the county commissioner books. Also, I've been at the Historical Society Library, of course. Got a subscription to newspapers.com, and Ancestry were major helps.
Wow. Well, this is so exhaustive. Now, there's no book out there that has all this information, correct?
There will be.
There will be.
You're working on it, huh, Bev?
For today, then, we are the only place that has this level of information with you. So that makes me feel very grateful. Can I ask you I hone in on this. On Sunday mornings, did people go to local churches, or was there some sort of service that was brought into residents?
Well, I mentioned about Sarah Hines. I mean, if she was young and physically able and had friends in the community, she would go off to church in town. And if folks were able, I would believe they did. But for folks that were unable to get out and move around, at 2 o'clock in the afternoons, the college seminarians would come down and give worship services. And in the summer, when the students were gone, the local preachers would fill in that small chapel room. But I'm sure they expanded over into the sitting room, the parlor.
Okay. Well, I'm going to promise our audience I'm not going to absolutely dominate all the questions. There really are 2 ways you can be writing questions. I'm going to have one more question, but then while I'm talking, you should be thinking about either whether you want to ask the question in person by unmuting yourself and having a turn. We've seen a couple of chat questions come through already, so I'm going to do those chat questions first. If you'd like to do a chat question, this is a good time to start typing in your chat question. And if we've already answered it, we'll go over it. So my last question is, so were people just sort of free to come and go? It wasn't really like a lockdown situation, correct?
There were rules that you had to notify the steward when you were coming and going, of course. And especially during the times when this is not politically correct, but the tramp situation became so overwhelming, there were very stringent rules about coming and going. And if you wanted to stay, you had to be in by 8 o'clock and notify the steward of that. But yes, there were, if people were physically able, they would come and go, most often with someone that was on the staff there or the steward. I saw something there about married couples. Yes, there were married couples at the Almshouse, though very few.
So I've got a few questions. I'm just going to go from the top to the bottom. Of course, people are saying you did an excellent job, and I think that excellent. So one question was, how did you find out about the lives of the residents? And of course, is there a book written about the history of the Almshouse? And great talk.
How did I find out about the residents' lives? Is that what you said?
Yes.
Well, Laura Rogers, who's the assistant curator, and Scott Holniker at the curator, they have lots of information, and they kind of got me started and gave me a few tips about some of the people. I think it was Laura that told me about Lizzie and Mary being so inseparable. So you taking some of that information from them, plus the list that the Historical Society's website has, you can just start researching those folks. And when I'm going through newspapers, names just pop out that I may remember, or it'll say at the Almshouse. If I'm researching, you all know this, if you're researching one thing, something else will pop out at you that will grab your attention.
Definitely, definitely. So Wendy Wraith wants to know, are there any past residents or ghosts that still visit?
No.
Everybody loves a good ghost story.
Interesting question.
My feeling when I go into that house is good. I always greet the house. And we do that in our own house now that was built in 2009. Hello, house. How are you today? The house only gives good vibes. So
that's great. That's great.
Yeah.
So were there many husbands and wives, couples living there?
Yes, there were. There were very few. There was as I said, prior to the turn of the century, there was a German couple that were there. Dreisenbach. I remember they were part of my original script, but I had to, for time's sake, cut them down. But yeah, there were very few couples that lived there, though.
So we have a direct message that says, I'd love to hear more about the Maryland Prisoner Aid Society. I know a little bit about them, but understand that they did education and many other things. Perhaps someone can do a presentation in the future. So it's a recommendation for what we might want to hear about.
That I also discovered the Children's Aid Society, that I originally thought that all the children that came to the Almshouse, which is true, once they reached a certain age, there were few children that were there. They went out to be indentured servants, with Mrs. Gist at the farm next door to learn farming or to learn a trade. But the Maryland Children's Aid Society out of Baltimore, after the Civil War, they were seeking more foster homes, and they stretched their search into the counties. And in Carroll County, the panel of folks that would place children in need were selected church people. I found that interesting. And they would place the children, infants up to 5, 6, or 7 years. It was the primitive foster care way of doing things.
Wow. All right. So someone here, Diana Scott, is curious about the upper floor of the Almshouse. Oops, my computer just flipped. Could anyone who, she's curious about the upper floor of the Almshouse where the caretakers live. If you're standing there, would you be able to look out those small windows?
Yes. I know my friend Laura's listening to this answer. On the 3rd floor, which is a long way up, the rooms all now have our antiques or artifacts are stored there. There's a small library. I think it's on the 3rd floor. I can't remember right now. The 2nd floor, the administrative offices are there. Our curator's office is there. There's a sewing room and the library is on the 2nd floor. The steward and his family did and still do live on the 2nd floor. That part is off limits to the public, of course. But the 2nd floor has administrative offices and an apartment for the caretaker today.
Right. So were there any eligibility requirements to live at the Almshouse, or could anyone with an express need just come and live there?
By county commissioner's permission. They would make an application to say, I need to go. However, the caretakers were instructed to take in, especially during the time of when the tramps were coming through. They had to take care of them, which was a very difficult thing to do considering the numbers. And I often think to myself, Mr. Tracy, when he's gathering 8,000 heads of cabbage, they all got put to use for the number of people they had to feed.
So the story about the fireman and the maid is so interesting. Once they married, did they stay at the Almshouse or did they have to move on somewhere?
Oh, my young couple, John and Annie, I'm not clear. I do know that they eventually moved into Westminster. He left and went to work for Smith and Reifsnyder Lumber. So I don't know what circumstances caused them to leave employment at the Almshouse, but they did remain in Westminster.
So now we have Karen asking, what led you to be first interested in researching the history of the Almshouse?
Oh, wow. Well, Laura said, I'm going to be doing this. Why don't you do that? So I just started researching the residents that I came across and some of the stories that I was given. I wanted to affirm, researching for myself and see if I could extend the story any. I just found it interesting. My son's a history major, teaches history, and my daughter is an educator as well. But I just find it interesting. I don't know what to say as far as when I started volunteering there, I just wanted to find out further about the house, more about the house.
That makes sense. So are there any known living descendants of former residents?
I'm sorry, say again.
Are there any known living descendants of former residents?
Yes. Augustus and Ida's great grandson, Richard, and his wife, Linda, live in Westminster. I've spoken with them on the phone. He's close to 90s, 87, I believe. Then my friend, Jerry Reck, and her husband, Don, but Jerry is the great granddaughter of the Barnes. And she goes to our church. So and I spoke with her to ask her to listen today. I hope she is. Who was the other family? I'm sorry, I can't remember the other family that, but I'll come across, if I'm researching, I'll come across, oh, that person was born in 1925. They may still be alive. So you can research further to see if there's family in the community.
So is the Almshouse open for tours now, or are there COVID restrictions?
There are COVID restrictions for the house, though the property is open, I believe.
Great. All righty. Well, I have one last question, and then I think I'm going to go to the people who might want to ask verbal questions. In general, were living conditions good at the Almshouse?
From what I have read, I think, as I said, the expert care of the steward and the staff did their very best to make living at the Almshouse comfortable for the folks there. There were exceptions. Several times, well, not several, a couple times I read about men in the dormitory were not always the neatest folks in taking care of their surroundings. So once or twice when the grand jury came through, they did discover that. And it was my understanding that the room would have been cleaned, and within 2 days, when it would be the caretaker would go back to clean again, the men had not taken proper care of the area. But yeah, I'd say the food was certainly good. It was probably really hot up on the 3rd floor if you were up there in those tiny windows that you can see out of, but it was probably very hot. And they were always sewing and had clothes and whatever they needed, their needs were met.
Well, great. Now, if there's anyone who is on, who's unable to figure out how to do the chat, feel free to be polite, but unmute yourself and ask any quick question we have. Is there anyone out there?
I just
Hi.
wanted Beverly to know that in 1959 was the year that I was married and moved to Westminster. Tom had graduated from Western Maryland College and started teaching at West Middle School. And I always had a special place in my heart for those residents that they talked about. I never knew any of them personally, but just
Now, I
was
think
that
that's
same
Fran
year.
Miller talking, right, Fran?
Yeah, that's Fran Miller.
Good. Yeah,
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you, Beverly. Thank you.
Dan Ober has a question.
I do. Now, Bev, I know you are not a busy person. I know that you have lots of time on your hands. And anybody that knows Bev knows that that is not true. I don't know many people who are any more involved in this community than Bev. Tell me how you have had the time to create this talk, which is in depth and quite extensive. Where have you stolen time to do this?
Well, I don't know if it's correct to say, but thanks to COVID, I ain't going very far. My husband and I have decided to be very, I don't want to say isolated, but we don't go out very often. So I got a new computer and I enjoy working here in my room. So yes, I found the time because we don't have far to go or places to go to.
Well, that's amazing that you have created this talk
But
that is so thorough.
Jan, the book I'm working on, that is still in its draft edition because I put that aside to work on this once Chris asked me. And I was originally scheduled for May, so they backed me up to April. So
It's well done. And I know that
Thank
I'm
you.
not the only person that wants to say that, but well done
Thank you.
and very thorough. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Very,
Thank you, Dan. Is there anyone else who'd like to ask us any questions as we're
Yes,
getting close to closing?
I have a question.
Mhm.
Evelyn, is it you?
Yes, yes,
Oh, great.
Evelyn.
Evelyn, thank you.
I
Thanks for
don't know
joining.
my economic history and was wondering why there were so many tramps during that. That seems to have been around the beginning of the century. Does anybody have the answer to that? I do
Well, you
remember
know,
that
there was a major
Machines.
collapse of the economy in 1896.
Yeah.
And
Is
you
that-
see a lot of
Machines.
people on the streets because of that.
that's what I wondered. Mhm.
And I mean, Westminster was the folks, tolerated all of the folks that came to town up to a point. And
Well,
then
I
they
guess
started,
The
the
reason for
citizens
my
went to the county commissioners and said, you got to do something about this.
Yeah, the reason I was sort of interested, I grew up during the Depression in Reading, PA. We lived near the railroad tracks and they apparently got our address. The tramps would come around and my mother would feed them. And it was Depression times and the tramps would ride on the railroads and pass the address along. You can get a good meal there.
Yeah, there used to be hobo signs to my grandfather's parsonage where you could get a good meal, and the hobos left signs along the way, so they knew
That
where
was
to
it.
stop.
We were a parsonage.
Well, thank you for sharing that, Evelyn. That's a look. Very
All
nice.
right, so if there may be a lot more questions, I understand, because this is such an interesting topic. I want to thank Beverly for her email. She listed her email so that people can ask her further questions, and that's so very generous of her. Was there any last licks anyone wants to get before we say thank you for the day?
And just ask a quick question, please. First of all, it was a terrific talk. Really, it was great. Thank you. Since you had men and women living there, Well, first of all, did they live pretty far apart in like the different buildings? And was that a problem? Did they get together, or I mean, by choice or not? You know.
One of the reasons that this particular almshouse was so successful is the men and women were separated. The men were in one building and the women were in another. Plus, they were 3 floors up. So, yes, that aided in the success of the whole operation. As far as getting along, I didn't come across anything that was disturbing as far as the men and women having conversations or arguments or whatever. I didn't come across anything like that.
All right, folks. Well, we want to thank you. We have run over just a little bit, but not by a whole heap. I want to thank everybody, and I want to just tell them that we have a few things coming up yet for May. In May, we have Preservation Month. We're going to be celebrating that whole hog here at the Historical Society. On the 15th, we're looking for volunteers to come and help clean up the campus. We have both indoor and outdoor cleaning jobs for people, and we're really hoping that maybe you'll come and help us get back into shape for welcoming in the general public sometime this summer when we hope the COVID restrictions are lifted. We do have a pastime for children's, but I understand it's actually sold out already, so I don't want to pressure that one too much. On the 18th, we're going to do another virtual box lunch, and we're going to be talking about the Westminster Historic District Commission, and I'm actually going to lead that talk, but we'll also talk about local, state, and federal tax credits, so that if you don't live in Westminster, you still can benefit from state and federal tax credits, and we kind of fall in the same category. So I hope you're willing to listen to that and how you can help preserve and protect historic buildings. On the 22nd, by acclamation and demand, Mimi Ashcraft and Dave Bear are going to be leading another talk of the Westminster Historical Cemetery. And last time it sold out. So I recommend if anybody's interested in that cemetery walk, they sign up by calling the HSCC. So I want to thank everybody very much. I want to remind everybody to stay safe, and we will see you next month. Thank you.
Thank you, Beverly.
Thank you.
Thank
My
you.
pleasure.
Excellent.
Thank
Very
you.
good. Really enjoyed it.
Thanks for letting me get in on the last minute notice. I appreciate
We're
it.
looking forward to the book.
Okay.